Welcome to Crawlspace. I'm Tim here today with Lance. Lance, how are you today?
I'm doing fantastic today, Tim. We have finally brought a guest on this show that can satisfy this curiosity itch that we've had for a little while that involves this very strange piece of, I guess we're going to call it literature at this point, but we get into this conversation with the very fascinating guests that we have on, and I think a lot of people are going to be really engaged in what we're talking about here because it's kind of relevant to things that are happening in today's world. We bring up the NSA, for example, in connection to this like nearly 600-year-old manuscript that is the subject of the conversation. But Tim, the subject of this intro really should be about your mood. How are you today?
I'm doing well. I'd hate to make the subject about my mood because it's not as interesting as the story that we're covering here today. So in this interview, we have Jillian Foley on. And Jillian's got a really great background. She's got a PhD from the University of Chicago's Conceptual and Historical Studies of Science program. And that really kind of makes her an expert to discuss this Voynich manuscript that is full of mysteries everywhere you look, Lance. And Jillian actually wrote an article about the Voynich manuscript a few years ago. It's called The Strange Quest to Crack the Voynich Code. And it's really about how many people over the years and centuries have been obsessed with trying to figure out this mystery that is the Voynich manuscript.
And it's really interesting because as famous and mysterious as the Voynich manuscript is, it was never valued at anything significant. It was never sold for anything significant. People tried to sell it, but that didn't work out. People would buy it for cheap, thinking they could sell it big. But I think because the mystery is so dense and the code itself has never been cracked, it just never garnered a high price tag, but it does garner a high level of interest. There are groups that have formed to try to solve this. There are people who claim to have solved it. I think she said like 2 or 3 in the past, year or so have said that they've solved this. They've cracked the code. The way how this all came together with Jillian was really interesting. You mentioned the article that she wrote. You can find that article on undark.org. And we were connected with Jillian through another guest who joined us to discuss how poisons can be used as murder weapons. And that's called All the Poisons with Professor Deborah Blum, and you can listen and watch that on Spotify. It's episode 515, released on May 7th. Very interesting conversation. And Deborah is one of the publishers of Undark. So when we looked into Deborah on Undark, we discovered this article that Jillian wrote about the Voynich manuscript, which led us to ask Deborah if she could put us in touch with Jillian. So that's just how the behind the scenes work here. So Deborah ended up making that introduction with Jillian, which I just thought was a cool way to get additional guests on and open up more of these conversations that we'd love to have.
Yeah, and it's a fascinating mystery. So many mysteries within this one mystery. There's just a lot here. So we hope you enjoy this episode. Please follow us on social media at Crawlspace Podcast or Crawlspace Pod. Hey, give us a 5-star review while you're out there. And Lance, just want to let everyone know that this is a video show now on Spotify. So if you're not listening on Spotify, you can do so there and you can watch as well.
One more quick thing before we go. We are going to CrimeCon this September 5th through September 7th. It is in Denver, Colorado. And if anyone is still deciding whether or not to attend, perhaps this will put you over the edge here. We have a 10% discount if you go to crimecon.com, and your standard pass will be 10% off by using the code Crawlspace at checkout. That's all one word, and you can hang out with us and a number of other true crime content creators. And they also have an amazing list of presenters, and that list seems to be growing daily. Okay, so we hope to see you there. CrimeCon, September 5th, 6th, and 7th, Denver, Colorado. Promo code Crawlspace, 10% off, but 100% on if you want to hang out with Tim and I.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program. Jillian Foley, welcome to the podcast. How are you today?
Good, thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, thank you so much for joining us and making your way onto this recording platform. We apologize for the technical difficulties that you may have experienced before you got here, so we hope to make up for that with some really fascinating conversation. This is something that has been literally floating around my house for years. But before we get into that, can you let the listeners know a little bit about yourself and maybe what brings you to the show today?
Sure. My name is Jillian Foley. I have a PhD in, it's a mouthful, Conceptual and Historical Studies of Science. I like to shortcut and just say I have a history PhD. My specialty in research is the history of cryptography. I am working on a book. I don't have a publication date for it yet, but it will be out someday, on the history of sort of more modern cryptography from about 1970s, sort of computer cryptography in the United States. But today we will be talking about something much older than that, which was a pet research project of mine when I was in graduate school.
Okay, we will get into that, but you swung for the fences with your degree, so we got to dig in a little deeper on that. How did you get into that? When did you realize like this is something that is not only cool, but something that you can make that part of your life?
My interest in cryptography started at some point when I was in like middle school, maybe. I don't think I have the book on my shelf, but there's a book by a writer named Simon Singe called The Code Book, I think it was called. I picked it up as like a 14-year-old and was like, oh, this is cool. Like, this is cool stuff. But I was a big nerd as a kid. And then when I got to college, undergrad, I was a math and history double major, which I got a lot of comments about all the time. I would tell people I was a math and history double major and they would go, wow, those are different. Thank you. The thought when I was an undergrad of what if I could combine those two things together as part of my senior project, and everyone sort of looked at me like I was crazy. And so I didn't do it. I worked in tech after graduating. I worked in tech doing consulting and working in startups for 5 years. And then eventually I was like, no, I just really like doing historical research. It's really fun. Let me go back to that idea I had in undergrad about what if I could sort of smash my two interests. And now that I'd done some coding with computers and stuff, and I was like, what if I take the math and the computers and the history and sort of mush them together and see what happens. And I was like, history of cryptography sort of covers all three of those things. That's the story of how I ended up there.
That's amazing. Have you ever tried to decode any of the zodiac ciphers?
I have not. I stick with the history. I do not do so much of the decoding. I do have a friend who recently started, there's a statue, I guess it's technically a statue outside the NSA headquarters at Fort Meade. I think that's where it is, called Kryptos. The sculptor has said that it's encrypted. It like looks like an encrypted message. And I think there's 3 panels and the third one hasn't been decrypted yet. And people are constantly contacting him and saying that they've gotten it. And he's like, nobody's gotten it. I have a friend who's into that kind of thing. And she's like, well, this is going to be my fun side project for a little while, is trying to decrypt. That's not my jam. I prefer to leave the code breaking to the code breakers, and I just study the history of it.
Are the codes and what is being analyzed always letters, or is it a combination?
It can be anything. I actually right here, I taught a class when I was in grad school. I taught a class on history of cryptography, and I let my students sort of design their own final projects if they wanted to. They could write a paper, they could do something else. One of my students made me encrypted coasters. This is knitted. I don't remember what the message is, and I don't still have her paper, so I couldn't tell you, but this was like a message. She was pretending she was sending messages in a war, and was like, this message was something like attack at dawn at, whatever. What? So I have 3 of these little encrypted coasters that one of my students made me, and I keep it on my desk. So it could, you could encrypt anything with anything. There's lots of different ways to sort of hide information in places. You can use letters. Letters are commonly done just because it's easy to write and to transmit, but you could encrypt stuff in knitting. You could encrypt stuff in symbols or in drawing. A sort of classic spycraft that you see sometimes in like old spy movies is someone will have a book. I don't have a book handy, so I can't like illustrate. And in the book, you would take another sheet of paper and put it on top of the book and then just cut out tiny little holes so that only some letters show through. So the key on that one would be the page with the holes in it. And so you could give that to someone and tell them what page in a book to go look at, and they just put it down on top of that and then read the message. That's not strictly speaking a cipher, but it is a way of like sort of doing hidden language in plain sight.
Well, how did you come across the Voynich manuscript, and what were your first thoughts there? That's
a great question. I actually have no idea where I came across it the first time, but when I came across it again in grad school, I was actually I came into grad school with this initial idea of I was going to do research on the NSA, the National Security Agency, where federal top secret code breaking research has been done since the 1950s. It was established after World War II. What I started out doing for one of this other classes, I had come across in the summer before I started graduate school, I came across this online record that had been declassified of this internal magazine that people who worked at the NSA wrote for themselves and they circulated. It was called Cryptolog. It's got the usual kind of like internal company stuff, like talking about like the picnics and the changes in reorg and that kind of more boring stuff. It also has the kind of stuff that you would expect like a big group of like really nerdy people who work on signals analysis and code breaking to do. So it's full of like really weird puzzles. It's got a lot of like weird Cold War type stuff where there's like jokes about the Soviets and people draw cartoons and things like that. And I was like, okay, let me do some research in this really cool archive that I could look at. And I was going through this and doing some other research on this. And I came across an article in this, it's in the 1970s. So it's not super old, about this 15th century manuscript. And I was like, why are they talking about a medieval manuscript in this fairly technical staff magazine at the NSA? Like, that's weird. And I kept looking and I found another one and I kept looking and I found another one. And so I started digging more into that, being like, why does this keep showing up? And it turns out that the Voynich Manuscript had quite an interesting history at the NSA, which I was not expecting. And so I did a little bit more digging, trying to see what role that this weird thing that I had come across played at the NSA specifically in the mid 20th century. A really interesting, weird thing. And so once you find it, you kind of have to go looking more.
Exactly. This is, like I said, something that's been floating around where I live for a little while. So I'm holding it right now.
Oh,
this is not an original copy.
Yeah. Is that the newest one? The replica that the Yale put out, or was that an older
I don't
one?
know. It's edited by Raymond Clemens with an introduction by Deborah Harkness. And
okay, I think that so. The manuscript itself lives at the Rare Books Library at Yale University.
Yes, this is the Rare Books and Manuscript Library in association with Yale University. Okay.
Yeah, they put out recently. They took all new pictures and put out a new book that you can buy. So I'm guessing you have that. I was just talking to my 5-year-old about this the other day, and she's like very into it now. And she's like, can we buy a copy of that? And I was like, yeah, I guess we can. So maybe I'll have one soon.
Can you give us some background on this? Who put this together?
So the manuscript known as the Voynich Manuscript, what we know for sure about it is that a Polish rare book dealer who lived in the United States, I think he lived in New York, named Wilfrid Voynich, bought it in the early 1900s, so like 1912-ish. And there was a letter that came with it. It's just sort of like it's like a 240-ish page codex. So like a book, not like a scroll, bound in with a very plain cover. It's made of parchment. It's a true manuscript. So it's handwritten, hand illustrated. He bought it and was like, this thing is weird and cool because it is written in a script that nobody can read. So we've never seen anything like it before. We've never seen anything like it since. The letters, they look like letters. They don't look like letters of any language that anybody uses now. The pictures that go with it, so it is like a classic Western European illustrated manuscript. It's got like very beautiful illustrations on a lot of the pages. There's a lot of plants. No one's quite sure what most of the plants are. There's a lot of stars and sort of like possibly like constellations or like labeled things. It might be kind of zodiac. We're not really sure. The weirdest ones, there's a bunch of pages that have just like pictures of naked ladies taking baths in like very complicated looking tubs with like these sort of pipe looking things that might be supposed to be pipes for the water. They might be something alive. It's sort of hard to, it's all very kind of organic looking. So it has these beautiful pictures. It has this very mysterious looking alphabet. And Voynich saw this and was like, oh, this thing is going to make me rich. And so he bought it and took it on sort of a national tour of the United States, showing it off at various places, trying to drum up a buyer who would pay him a lot of money for this very mysterious, very old manuscript that he was convinced, based on the letter that he had found in it, that it was from a 15th century alchemist named John Dee. He thought John Dee had sold it to Rudolph II or something like that, but nobody bought it. And he tried and tried and tried for years and years and years, and nobody bought it. He eventually died. And then I think his wife tried to sell it for a number of years. She finally sold it for not very much money to another rare book dealer That rare book dealer also tried to sell it for a really long time. So it was a very popular manuscript. His national tour worked in the sense that lots of people wanted to come look at it because it's very cool and old and mysterious, but nobody wanted to buy it, partially because the provenance is sort of iffy. We're not exactly sure where it's from. So eventually the guy who had bought it from Voynich's wife gave up and donated it to Yale. And that's how it ended up at Yale. Things that we know for sure, or scientifically are fairly sure about the manuscript, they have dated the parchment that is written on using, like carbon dating techniques. The parchment is indeed old. It's from the 15th century. The inks, they've done some analysis on the inks. The inks are, at the very least, made using medieval ink recipes. So in theory, it's possible that someone could have gone out of their way to be I'm going to make ink like a 16th century scribe would have made ink and drawn it, but it seems much more likely. And the manuscript style in general is very in line with manuscripts that would have been made around the same time in Western Europe. So generally scholars, medieval historians, the rare books people tend to agree that it seems likely that the book was in fact actually made in the 15th or 16th century in Central or Western Europe.
And there is no way of deciphering any of the symbols that seem to be letters that we have never identified yet.
Very many people have tried. Since Voynich found it and went on his national tour, there have been hundreds and hundreds. I was just looking just this morning. There's at least 2 more in the last couple of years of people claiming to have deciphered this manuscript. I mean, it's a very compelling mystery. It's not the only unsolved cipher manuscript, not even the only old unsolved cipher manuscript, but Voynich did successfully make it the most popular unsolved cipher manuscript.
Now, were the letters and the symbols, do you think that they represented something else? Because this is where I'm always trying to wrap my head around it. Is there a decoding to it?
We don't know, and it's possible we'll never know. People are still hopeful that we might know. So here's some things that people more recently have sort of concluded about it. People have done analysis on the letters. One of the interesting things with this is that since it's written in a language that you can't understand, you have to come up with a transcription first where you take, okay, this loopy thing that looks like this, I'm going to call that A, and this loopy thing that looks like that, I'm going to call that B, just so that you can type it into a computer and do any kind of analysis with it. Otherwise, you're doing it all by hand like it's World War I. Once you've done that kind of transcription and you can do some analysis on it, looking at the words, looking at the letters, looking at the letter and word frequencies. So this is very classic cryptanalysis techniques that people have been doing for a long time, but that were sort of mathematized and formalized starting in World War I, primarily by a husband and wife team named William and Elizabeth Friedman, who worked on decrypting stuff during World War I and then later again during World War II. These types of techniques where you take, okay, let's look at sort of what could be gibberish. So in this case, it's this old manuscript that I've transcribed, but it could be an encrypted message that you've intercepted from somebody. It could be, like you mentioned, the Zodiac killer's messages that you're trying to decipher. It's all gibberish, but you can say, okay, let's count up the number of times the letter E shows up. Let's count up the number of times the letter J shows up. That's called frequency analysis. And if you know you're decoding something into English, if you look at any long stretch of English text, E is always going to be the most frequent letter. The least frequent letter is probably going to be something like Z or Q, right? So if you know that you're dealing with a pretty simple, I'm just swapping one letter out for another, in English, that's pretty easy. You can do that by hand. You count, okay, I see that J shows up a lot. And so J probably stands for the letter E. And then the next one would probably be S and then A, going on like that. And so people have done that sort of analysis on the Voynich manuscript, and they've done sort of building on that over the years as these sort of statistical techniques have gotten more sophisticated. They've continued doing this type of statistical analysis. More computational linguistic analysis is one of the more recent things that people have started doing. And it looks like the Voynich manuscript, people agree, is not totally random. There is some sort of underlying pattern to it. People sort of disagree about whether the underlying pattern might be a constructed language or built according to some kind of generative algorithm. There's one guy in particular who has that theory. And a couple of people have done some research using the Voynich manuscript saying, okay, we think it might be this type of algorithm. Let's see what happens if we try to generate similar text using a similar algorithm. Will it be statistically similar to what we see in this actual manuscript? Other people say, okay, no, there's other types of linguistic computational analysis we can do to this manuscript to say, no, this actually looks like language to us. So you have like the frequency of letters follows sort of a similar pattern to the frequency of letters in real languages. You see the frequency of words sort of follows a similar pattern where a small number of words show up a lot. And then I'm not a linguist, so I get kind of lost in some of the details with some of this research, but things about the way that parts of words get built into bigger words, the way that we do in English, that famously they do a lot in German, that the patterns of the way that pieces of words show up again in longer words sort of matches what could plausibly be a real language. So at this point, most people who study the Voynich manuscript seem to think that it's probably a real language under there somewhere, or at the very least a constructed language, something like Esperanto or Elvish. But I think more likely people think it's a real language.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsor.
And a thank you to our sponsors. Back to the program.
Wow, so no known language, but is it possible that it was a language that people used back, what is it, 15th century?
Yeah, that's possible. There have been a lot of theories. So like some of the theories that I've seen, there has not been any one theory where someone has said, I have decoded this, that people have agreed on. Let's be clear about that. There's lots of people who have claimed it, and a lot of them still will claim that their thing is right. But it has not been widely accepted, any of these theories. But people have said that it's an old version of Turkish. People have said that it's a vulgar version of Latin. People have said that it's biblical Hebrew. People have said that it's a mishmash language called Proto-Romance that I don't think is a real thing. Let's see here. What else have I heard? I've heard people say that maybe it's Coptic, like Egyptian, like church script. Yeah, lots and lots of different things. There's also some other approaches that people have taken to the manuscript. There's this one guy who's a botanist who has said, okay, forget about the words. I'm not going to try to decode the words. He thinks that he's identified all of the plants. And he thinks that all of the plants are plants that were native to the Americas in the 16th century, and that it's actually like a Mesoamerican treatise on botany from that period. People generally don't agree with him either.
Well, do you think that they don't agree with him because that's not as exciting? Because when I look at this, it really does look like it's a guidebook for plants and herbs and, agriculture. And that doesn't feel as like stimulating as like, we're breaking the code of why humans are here. I think that's what people actually wanted.
Yeah, there's some amount of that could be going on, but I do think a lot of the, let's just say, more reputable scholars who work on this, I think they all genuinely are quite invested in solving it. It's not a super popular academic topic. I've had interviewed people who've worked on this who've called it hot potato that you don't want to touch for too long.
What, because you go down a rabbit hole like too quickly and you get stuck there for too long?
Partially that, partially just because so many people have claimed that they've solved it and then is immediately debunked. And that doesn't look good, as an academic for your publishing record if you write a paper and then it gets retracted. It's not like a totally taboo topic for academics to work on, but the idea of like sort of claiming that you've solved the whole thing. But that was actually one of the interesting things that I found when I was looking at it in the context of the NSA. The people at the NSA are not academics in the traditional sense, being that they all work on top secret stuff. There's less of that problem at the NSA. And one of the interesting things that I found with this is that it solves some problems that cryptanalysts at the NSA have, namely that because they work on top secret stuff, they can't always even talk to each other about the actual stuff. So if you're in the 1970s and you're working on intercepted Soviet messages, you might not even be able to talk to the cryptanalysts in the unit next door to you who are working on intercepted messages from China because everything is so compartmentalized. And so if you're saying, I have this really cool, interesting new cryptanalytic technique I would like to show you, you can't use any of the real stuff that you're doing with it because it's too secret. Some of the research that I did in grad school sort of showed that there were a handful of people at the NSA, and that's why I kept showing up in this magazine, because it was a useful way to say, let me illustrate this new technique that I've developed using something that we actually don't know how to decrypt. So it's not like I know the answer, right? Which is how a real encrypted message works, is you don't know what the answer is ahead of time. You might know what the language is in real life for a Soviet message or something, but you don't know what the answer is. And so using this weird manuscript sort of simulates the unknown aspect of it in a way that's useful for doing code breaking that is maybe not so useful for an academic writing an academic paper, unless you're an academic writing an academic paper and you've come up with a new computational linguistic analysis tool or a new machine learning algorithm or some sort of other way of comparing things. And you need a data set to say, let me apply this so I can show you what it looks like. You can't just write a paper that's like, I'm going to describe an algorithm. You have to actually show that it works and that it does what the kind of thing that you say it's going to do. And so in that sense, it's the manuscript is useful in that way to sort of illustrate, hey, here's this thing we don't actually know. Let's see what happens when I run this new fancy tool that I've made on it. But those people are generally not claiming that they've cracked the whole manuscript. They're just saying, okay, here's some sort of underlying pattern that I've uncovered. Here's an avenue for further research. Or in a lot of cases with these kinds of things, it's like, here, my algorithm works. Go use it. Like, some of those people don't actually care that much about the Voynich manuscript specifically. It just sort of serves this useful function for them.
That's incredible. So they'll use this to display how their algorithm would work, right? Mm-hmm. What's stopping them from getting too deep into actually solving it? Because I don't know, maybe like they're looking at it and they're like, wait a sec. I can apply this to more of the text here in the manuscript. Do they end up going down that road, or? Some
people do. And some people have made this sort of, I wouldn't say like their whole career, but some people have made a name for themselves as Voynich researchers. They've found a little community. There's a little, a pretty active group of people who exchange information online. I think a decent number of them, especially the more academic ones, had a conference a couple of years ago where they all got together and said, okay, let's all talk in the same room together about what we think we've put together about this manuscript. This is actually part of the interesting thing with some of these people who claim they've deciphered the manuscript, is that they're kind of outsiders to this little cadre of people who are really into the Voynich manuscript. Is they'll kind of parachute in and be like, no, I solved it, guys. And all of these people are like, no, you've completely ignored all of the work that we've been doing trying to uncover some of these patterns about the manuscript. But some of them they're very committed. When I wrote an article about this a couple of years ago when I did some interviews, and you would talk to them and be like, well, what do you think about all of the people who say that you're wrong? And they would just say things like, well, they're wrong and I'm right. It's simple, really, was the quote I got from one of them. Like, oh, it's simple. Right. Okay. Yes.
In researching this, I Googled the Voynich manuscript and aliens, and I was not surprised to see that many people have theories about that it was either written by aliens or some connection to aliens. There was no Ancient Aliens episode that I saw, but I kind of expected that to be.
Funny story about that, which is that I was actually, the History Channel called me up one day and asked me to come. Yes. Not to do Ancient Aliens, but I have a longstanding theory that the History Channel asks you to do something else, and then you sign a waiver, and then they will use it for Ancient Aliens. But I had just had a baby like 2 weeks earlier, and so I was not able to do it. So maybe that's why there's no Ancient Aliens episode on the Voynich manuscript. Yeah, there's lots of other theories about this kind of thing. People think that aliens wrote it or inspired someone to write it on their behalf. Some people think that there was like some sort of secret society and that this is the remnants of some kind of secret society that was doing like magic or prohibited medicine. And that's why there's like women and plants and stars, or it might be astrological or alchemical. There is a pretty long history of, especially for alchemy and some of the more esoteric medical history in this period, of people genuinely writing stuff in cipher. Like, we have a good number of manuscripts that have been deciphered of, okay, I'm writing about this sort of forbidden knowledge that will get me in trouble with the church, or that I'm trying to keep secret because I want to be the expert, alchemical guy who's going to come and turn all of your metal into gold. And so that wouldn't be that unusual. That wouldn't be that, unexpected to have a manuscript of this age that's written in cipher that is sort of hiding this kind of secret, magical, mystical kind of knowledge. I don't know. I mean, that's the thing with aliens. An interesting thing with the aliens is I was talking to another historian of science at UChicago, and he actually uses it, the Voynich manuscript, to teach about this concept. And he uses that and the movie Arrival, where the aliens come and they're trying to use their script to talk to us. He uses those two things to sort of illustrate this concept of scientific paradigms, where sometimes when there's something that's just so far outside of the way that we think about something, it's really hard to comprehend. And you don't know whether to tell if it's a fact or if it's not a fact, or how to explain it. You don't even notice things that are off about it necessarily, because it's just so far outside of your ken. So it's like, if it is aliens, like, maybe we'll never know, because how would we decode that? Unless the aliens came back and explained it to us. And so in that sense, it's sort of like, that's one of those theories that I think will never die, because we have no way of disproving it. Unless someone else, deciphers it and then everyone agrees that that was true.
And we'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program.
Getting on the alien thing, like keeping this topic going, if there's aliens and they're writing in this language, this code that we can't decipher, that leads me to my question about the page numbers. Are the page numbers that are on there, like, from that time period? Because they're actual numbers. It says, like, some pages say, like, 1 of 8 or, like, 4 of 8. I'm looking at it now. There's page 18 up in the, like, right-hand corner. Were those marked by somebody else, or is that actual numbers?
It's a little bit hard to say with some of the markings on there. There's some markings in the manuscript that you can tell are added later because they're in a different language, because it's obviously different handwriting. And then some of the other ones are like, well, this might have been at the same time. This might not have been at the same time. I think some of those page numbers like group the sections together, right? Like it's like, these are all the pages that go with like, these are all the naked ladies bathing. And that's part of how they've grouped, okay, we think this is sort of like on this topic, these ones go together, and on this topic, these ones go together. There is some disagreement about whether the way that the manuscript is bound now was the original order, because there's some evidence that the binding on the manuscript that Voynich found, the plain, I think it has like a leather cover on it. There's some evidence that was not the original binding, that it was originally bound in wood. So we're not 100% sure the order of the pages that they would have been originally in, especially since they're not all numbered, 1 through 240, the way that we would number them today. So it's hard to say. I know that there's at least one scholar who's working on writing a paper trying to see, okay, I think maybe these went in a different order. Does that change at all our understanding of what they might say?
Was this written by one author or many, in your opinion?
People who study, it's called paleography, the handwriting of manuscripts, at this point have a pretty solid seeming theory that this was handwritten by probably about 5 people. That's the theory, and that multiple people have written it. That actually goes back. You can find people talking about that theory using statistical analysis all the way back in the 1970s and 80s stuff at the NSA, which is really interesting too. Yeah, people think that it was at least copied down by probably a handful of different people. Whether those people were the people who wrote the texts, we have no way of knowing, but it was copied down by probably at least 5 people, which means that at some point in time, there were 5 people who knew this freaking alphabet.
There's the alphabet, and then there's the images of the women that you mentioned, and it's like in a circle. It almost looks like one of like the like an Aztec calendar, and it does appear that this is something that is symbolizing like time that is something that is dependable, like a moon cycle or something like that. But it's not just women, right? Like there's horses. There seems to be like different images that are depicted along like around the circle. Do you think it's a calendar that represents moon cycles or seasons?
I think it could very well be a calendar or some kind of like other, some kind of zodiac type depiction of especially since there's other sections that have a lot of stars in them, that it would make sense if here's all the stars, and then here's a depiction of how to understand those stars in some kind of zodiacal type cyclical thing. Another interesting thing I think with the images, especially when you get into the plants, where people are like, well, we don't recognize these plants. We've all seen them, medieval manuscripts, that in theory, it's this monk drawing a picture of an elephant, but he's never seen an elephant in his life. And so it looks like the most messed up, bizarre version of an elephant you've ever seen. And those ones, it's like, well, we know this is an elephant because it's written in English or Latin or whatever. And it says this is an elephant. But for this one, it's like, okay, maybe people were drawing these pictures of plants or drawing some sort of calendar that they've heard someone describe to them, and they're trying to draw it and they can't actually draw it. Where, the aliens want to tell them, here's what our calendar looks like, and I have to write it down. But until we can see what the text says, it's like, well, we have no way of knowing for sure what they thought they were drawing, because maybe they weren't as good at drawing as we want them to be, right? The illustrations with the circles and the sort of, that looks like it could be a calendar, they're less sort of figurative than some of the other drawings. It's less obviously like, here's a drawing of a thing. Some people had theories, and this gets back to one of the very earliest theories of someone who looked at it when Voynich still had it, that it was actually, the manuscript was actually written by Roger Bacon, an early like polymath early Renaissance man type figure who who did a lot of things in a lot of different arenas of what we would now call science. And the theory with that was that he was drawing what he was looking at through a microscope, which would have made him have been the inventor of the microscope like 100 or 150 years before what we now consider to be the inventor of the microscope. So that one was an interesting theory. And it was like, well, that's what these like sort of circular drawings are, is he's looking at these things and the figures are like, well, I'm seeing this little thing swimming around in my microscope and I think it's a tiny little horse, or I think it's a tiny little dragon. He was actually looking at like bacteria or single cell organisms or something like that. Most people don't think that that's true. Or the other one was that he was actually had invented the telescope, or possibly both, and that he was looking at galaxies, and that those are drawings of galaxies that he was seeing through his telescope that he would have invented separately and earlier than Galileo.
Yeah, gotcha. I mean, if anybody hasn't looked into this, I mean, a good starting point are these images that are in circles, because if you have like a slightly curious mind, you'll start making connections. And you're right with the elephant example. If you've never seen an elephant, you just had someone describe an elephant and you tried to draw it, it would look like a nightmare version of an elephant. But that's kind of the case here. Like in the center of some of these circles, we have something that looks like maybe a lobster. There's several that look like rams or goats. This one looks like a cat, but I'm not sure.
Let me just add real quick that I've seen an elephant in real life, and if I drew one, it would look much like the elephant in the Voynich manuscript.
Even though you saw it in real life. I feel like that's the path that is the most reasonable, is that there's something to do with like the zodiac, astrological signs. There's a big sun in the middle of one of them, or it looks like a sun. There's like a face and like these stars coming off of it. I don't know. Like, I feel like if you haven't seen this before, this is a good starting point.
There's also a couple of the pages with the women in the tubs.
Yeah.
The naked women in the tubs, where there's at least one that really looks like it's got sort of a tub in the middle, and then the like organic kind of looking pipes come up and go off to either side. And then there's a woman on either side, and their hands are sort of held out towards the tubs that might also be tubes. And you kind of look at that and you're like, that looks like a uterus and the fallopian tubes and then two ovaries on either side. And so then there was also some ideas of like, okay, is this a biological treatise? And you're just sort of doing some sort of abstraction, artistic rendition using women to stand in for the organs. But it doesn't take too many leaps to look at some of these pictures and be like, well, that kind of looks like it could be the inside of a body, bizarre kind of way.
Also, I'm sorry, I have to keep going on this. There's definitely a heavy feminine representation here. On one of them where it looks like, I don't know, it looks like a cat. I'm not sure what it is, but looks like a star that's kind of like coming, it like a string attached to a star, and it looks like this animal has a string in its mouth. On the top of the circle, there are 4 women, and they're each labeled. And I immediately thought, well, maybe that represents like different seasons. Just like a heavy feminine influence here. Could this have been a group of females in a tribe that might have been?
It could be something like that. It could be, I know in other parts of the world, I think less so in Europe, but in other parts of the world, you see things like women who were, denied access to education for any number of reasons, forbidden from writing, would invent their own sort of women's script as a way to sort of exchange information and keep it out of, essentially out of the hands of the patriarchy. I was listening to a talk through the Getty by one of the medieval rare books historians who has been in this the longest. Her name is Lisa Fagan Davis. And she was explaining that her personal pet theory, she's like, I have no evidence for this, but what she hopes that it will turn out to be is a handbook written by a group of women to transmit and manage knowledge about how to deal with women's issues, how to deal with, the seasons or astrological stuff. And she thinks that the size, it's about the size of a modern size book. It's not like a huge fancy thing that's meant to be displayed. She's like, it's the size that someone could carry around. It shows a lot of evidence of use, like stuff has been dripped on it. There's spills. There's a couple of rips. There's like, I think at least one page that has a hole in it. And so she thinks it's possible that it was originally like some kind of women's group, maybe some nuns, maybe a secret sect, who knows, of women had like made this manual and they were using it to transmit knowledge amongst themselves. So that very much could be what it ends up being.
I like that a lot because it does feel like it's a book of remedies or a book of something that can potentially make your child feel better if they have an upset stomach or something, with all of the herbs and the plants and everything.
And the other interesting thing about this, especially when you think back to the context of this period in Europe, is that it could be that and also a book of magic or alchemy or something. Like there was way less in this period in the 14th, 15th, 16th century. There was way less of a separation between things that we would call religion and things that we would call magic and things that we would call science and things that we would call medicine. Those things were all just sort of like much more, all just part of life back then. And so it's very likely too that all of these things might be part of it, that the fact that there's stuff that looks like an astrological calendar might mean that it actually is about astrology or looking at the heavens or stars, and that it might actually be about herbal medicinal remedies, and that it might actually be about like doing some sort of weird feminine magic.
What is your favorite part of the mystery?
To me, just love how beautiful the whole thing looks. Like, to me, it's really interesting that the script is not just that we can't read it, but that it's actually like quite a beautiful looking script, and that the figures are, like they're very weird, but they're very nice to look at. So it shows to me, I think, that someone put a lot of care and attention, and not just attention in terms of carefully copying out this 240 pages across possibly 5 people, but that they wanted to make it look nice. And that if you were inventing a script, they wanted to invent a script that looked beautiful, which to me is really, really interesting part of all of this. And, this was a non-trivial amount of resources at the time to have this much parchment and this much ink and this much time.
Right. So if anybody were to actually have like a ironclad solution to this, in your opinion, and I think this is my opinion as well, it's probably not going to be anything that's earth-shattering. Is that your opinion? I mean, we're not going to, again, let's use the alien example. It's not going to definitively prove that there are aliens on another planet who sent this to us.
Stop it. Lance, it was written by aliens.
I think that's unlikely. Like, I'm thinking to the Dead Sea Scrolls, when they found the Dead Sea Scrolls in a cave, and it was like that completely changed our understanding of that period of Middle Eastern early pre-biblical history, of like, oh, there was a whole separate sect who had a completely different canon of religious writings that overlapped some way with the stuff that eventually became the Bible, but was not exactly the same. And they had all these other texts, and that sort of upended our understanding of the history of that region and the history of religion in that region. To me, I feel like the most earth-shattering thing that could happen would be something like that. If we could decode it and it was like, oh, actually there was like a very active secret society of women who was doing this sort of type of knowledge production in their own special secret way that was well funded and well resourced, and somehow we just didn't know about them until this. Like, I think that would be really cool. And I don't know, maybe it will tell us that the aliens built the pyramids. I feel like there would be pictures of pyramids though, if it was about something like that.
I think that they would probably give some indication.
Well, I mean, Jillian, give me a break. Like, the aliens didn't build the pyramids. Come on.
No, of course not. Of course
I mean, they wrote this manuscript, but they did not.
They were too busy writing the manuscript to have built the
pyramids. Thank you so much for joining us here today, Jillian. This is really, really interesting stuff. And definitely let us know when your book is coming out. We'd love to speak with you again about your book.
Yeah, thank you so much.
And in your spare time, just give a Zodiac cipher a look over, just a once over.
Yeah, if I pick it up, if I pick up code breaking, I'll let you guys know what my discoveries are.
Appreciate it.
Sounds good.